The strap snapped before I even hit the canopy. 1 second I was inside Survey Pod 7, watching the altimeter spin the wrong direction, and the next I was hanging upside down from a harness tangled in something thick and alien, the wreck of the pod steaming 30 feet below me in a river that moved like oil and smelled like copper. My ears were ringing. My right side felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against my ribs. I took a breath. It hurt in the specific way that means something is cracked, not broken through. I knew the difference because I had broken ribs before and cracked ones, and I had a grandmother who made me memorize the distinction when I was 9 years old, because she said knowing the difference between what will kill you and what only feels like it will kill you is the most important skill a person can have. Her name was Nora. She grew up in a place where that kind of knowledge mattered. I thought about her a lot in the following 23 days. I got myself down from the tree using the multi-tool clipped to my thigh, the one piece of gear I had that survived the crash without damage. Everything else in the pod was either shredded, submerged, or on fire. I salvaged what I could before the fire reached the fuel cell. 6 days of rations, a water purification strip kit, a thermal blanket, 2 signal flares, and a field manual I had already memorized. The beacon was crushed under a section of hull. I tried to fix it for 11 minutes, decided it was beyond fixing, and moved on. There was no point sitting next to a broken beacon on a world rated Class 9 lethality, mourning what I could not change. Class 9 lethality. That was the official classification of Kethvara in the Interstellar Academy's planetary database. It meant the planet had been assessed as highly dangerous to non-native life forms, with multiple categories of threat including ambient atmospheric toxicity in certain regions, extreme weather events, and most significantly, megafauna predators capable of killing anything smaller than a light armored vehicle without meaningful effort. I had studied the briefing files. I knew what lived out there. I knew the names the xenobiologists had given to the primary predators, and I knew the survival ratings for each encounter type. The Vakari, for instance, were rated at a 4% survival rate for an unarmed encounter. They were pack hunters, 6-limbed, fast over short ground, with serrated bone ridges along their forearms instead of claws. The briefing called them opportunistic but relentless. It said if you encountered a pack, your best option was to find high ground and wait them out. I was on the ground, injured, next to a smoking crash site that would attract every scavenger in a 5-kilometer radius, and I had exactly 0 options for high ground that were currently accessible. So I did not wait them out. I heard the pack before I saw them, a low clicking sound, fast and rhythmic, the way the briefing described their communication when they were coordinating a surround. I had my back to the pod's remaining hull section, which meant nothing could approach me from behind. I had the multi-tool in my hand, which is a folding device about 20 centimeters long that includes a blade, a wire cutter, a compression driver, and a pry bar. Not a weapon. Not remotely a weapon by any military definition. But I had been gripping tools since before I could read, and a tool in the hand of someone who is not afraid is a different thing than a tool in the hand of someone who is. The lead Vakari came through the tree line first. As they always do, the pack sends the dominant animal ahead to assess. It was larger than I expected. The briefing said they averaged 90 kilograms. This one was closer to 120. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at me with the flat, calculating attention of an animal that had never in its evolutionary history encountered something it was not confident it could handle. I looked back. I did not have a plan. I want to be honest about that. What I had was a cracked rib, 6 days of food, a multi-tool, and the particular quality of attention that my physical training instructor at the academy called, in an unflattering tone, my default expression. She said it made me look like I was making a list of problems and planning to solve them one at a time. She did not mean it as a compliment. I thought it was a perfectly reasonable way to look at the world. The Vakari took 1 step into the clearing. I took 1 step toward it. I do not know what that communicated in Vakari behavioral terms. I know what it communicated in my own head, which was, the space between us is 30 feet. You weigh more than I do, but I have already done the math on what I am going to do with this pry bar and where I am going to aim it, and I have made a decision, and I am not changing it. The animal stopped. We stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then it made a sound I did not recognize, not the clicking of coordination, something shorter and lower, and it turned and walked back into the tree line. The rest of the pack followed it. They did not circle around. They did not split and flank me. They left, completely. The clicking faded into the general noise of the forest, and then the forest went quiet in a different way, the way that meant large things were moving away rather than hiding. I stood in the clearing for another 30 seconds. Then I taped my ribs, ate half a ration bar, and started planning my route to the emergency relay station, which was 340 kilometers to the northwest across primary jungle, 2 mountain ridges, and a river system that the briefing described as seasonally unpredictable. I had no communication equipment. I had no vehicle. I had cracked ribs and 6 days of food and a thermal blanket, and the knowledge that if I moved at a consistent pace and navigated correctly, I could cover the distance in approximately 18 days. The food would run out in 6. I made a note in my field journal, which was just the back pages of the field manual, since my actual journal was at the bottom of the oily river, that I would need to supplement rations with local forage by day 4 at the latest. The briefing had a section on edible local flora. I had memorized it. I was already cataloging the plants at the tree line against what I remembered, because there was no point in not starting immediately. The forest was loud with life. Things called from the canopy. Things moved in the undergrowth. Somewhere to my east, something very large was breathing in a slow, steady rhythm that meant it was sleeping or resting, and I noted its direction and filed it under things to be aware of rather than things to be afraid of, because being afraid of things you cannot currently do anything about is a waste of metabolic energy. My grandmother taught me that too. She taught me a great many things about the gap between being afraid and being in danger, and why people too often confuse the two. I shouldered my pack, a salvaged section of the pod's insulation foam wrapped around my supplies with a cable harness, and I walked into the jungle. I did not know then that the jungle was already watching me. I did not know that it had been watching me from the moment the pod broke the canopy, and that what it had seen had been passed from creature to creature in the complex web of scent and sound, and posture that the ecosystem used as its shared language. I did not know that the word the ecosystem was currently circulating. The closest equivalent in any language I might recognize was something like, do not. I just walked. I walked the way I always walked, which is forward and steadily, and without stopping for anything that did not require me to stop. Behind me, the clearing filled up with scavengers in less than an hour, drawn by the smell of smoke and the crash site. None of them followed me, not one. The first day was hard because of the ribs and the terrain. The second day was harder because I ran low on clean water before I found the first stream, and had to make a decision between pushing through or resting, and I chose to push through because resting felt wrong when I had a distance to cover. The third day I found the stream and the edible root clusters I had been looking for, and the pain in my ribs settled into a background hum that I could mostly ignore if I breathed carefully. I made camp each night in whatever cover was available. I kept a small fire when I could. I did not feel watched exactly, but I noticed things. I noticed that the animal sounds that typically surrounded a camp, the curious rustlings, the scent-marking approaches, the brief and opportunistic investigations that any competent naturalist would expect near a heat source and a food smell, were absent. The jungle was busy all around me, vibrant and loud during the day, alive with 1,000 competing urgencies. But near me, at my camp, in the immediate ring of firelight and beyond, there was a quality of space that took me until the third night to name correctly. It was not silence, it was clearance. Something was clearing a perimeter around me, and it was not me doing it. And I could not explain why, and I could not explain what was doing it, and I did not have enough information to draw a conclusion, so I wrote it down and kept moving. That is all you can do when you encounter something you do not yet understand. You observe it, you record it, you keep moving. On the fourth day, I saw the Goreth for the first time. I knew what it was immediately, because the briefing had dedicated 4 pages to it, and had included the blunt advisory that no researcher had ever successfully studied one at close range, and returned to file a complete report. It was approximately the size of a cargo transport, long and low, with a flat, armored head and a tail that dragged behind it through the undergrowth, flattening everything it touched. It had emerged from the ridgeline directly ahead of me, which was precisely the direction I needed to travel. I stopped. It looked at me. I looked at it. I checked my route options on the mental map I had been maintaining. Going around would add approximately 6 hours and take me through a drainage basin that the briefing flagged as seasonally flooded. Going back was not a direction I went. Going forward was where I needed to go. So I waited. And then the Goreth, which was the apex predator of a Class 9 lethality world, which had never been successfully studied up close, which had no natural predators and had presumably never in its evolutionary history moved for anything smaller than it was, stepped off the path. It moved to the right, into the undergrowth, and it waited there while I walked past it. I walked past it at a distance of approximately 8 meters. I could hear it breathing. I could feel the heat of it. I kept my pace steady and my eyes forward, not because I was trying to project anything, but because I had a destination and a timeline, and the Goreth was no longer between me and my destination. I wrote in my field notes that evening, interesting territorial behavior observed in Goreth specimen. Animal yielded right of way without aggressive engagement. Unclear whether this represents unusual individual behavior or species-wide response pattern. I did not yet understand what I was observing. But the jungle did. And it had been understanding it for 4 days, since the moment I walked out of that clearing with taped ribs and a pry bar and a destination, and started moving through it like the distance was just a problem to be solved, and the animals were just variables to be accounted for, and like it had simply never occurred to me to be stopped by any of it. Because it hadn't, that was the truth. It genuinely had not occurred to me. I had grown up on Earth. I had grown up in a place where the world tried, regularly and without any particular malice, to end you, where the weather was a negotiation, and the wildlife was an obstacle, and the terrain was a puzzle, and the correct response to all of it was not fear but problem-solving. Where my grandmother had walked 40 kilometers through a mountain pass at the age of 63, because the road was out and she had somewhere to be, and had arrived tired but entirely intact, and had made tea and gone to bed. I came from a long line of people who simply kept going. The jungle of Kethvara, in its ancient and collective biological intelligence, was beginning to understand this. And somewhere in the deep canopy, in nests and burrows and along patrol routes that had existed for millions of years, creatures were making adjustments. Routes were being updated. Habits were being quietly revised. The small, persistent, relentless thing that smelled like iron and exhaustion, and something older than fear, was moving through their world. They were getting out of its way. I made camp on the 4th night at the base of the first ridge, ate the last of my ration bars, supplemented with the root clusters I had been carrying, and slept for 6 hours. I did not dream. I never dream when I am working. There is too much that needs doing, and my mind seems to understand that rest means rest, and it does not waste the time. I woke before dawn, broke camp in 4 minutes, and started up the ridge. 314 kilometers to go. The jungle cleared a path in front of me, the way water parts for a stone, and I walked through it, one step at a time, the way I had been taught. The way I had always been taught. The way 200,000 years of surviving had built into every cell I had. I did not know I was remarkable. I just walked. The ridge took most of the first day and all of the second, which was not what I had planned, but plans on Class 9 worlds exist as intentions rather than guarantees. The terrain above the tree line was different: open rock faces, narrow ledges, wind that changed direction without notice and hit with enough force to require leaning into it. My cracked rib protested on the steeper sections, but I had taped it properly, and the pain was manageable if I controlled my breathing, which I did, because managing pain is a skill, and I had been practicing it since I was old enough to understand what practice meant. I reached the far side of the first ridge on the evening of the fifth day, and descended into a valley I had not accounted for in my route planning, because the valley did not appear on the briefing maps. The briefing maps for Kethvara were approximate at the best of times. The planet had been surveyed by 2 orbital passes and a handful of ground teams, none of whom had covered the interior in any systematic way, for obvious reasons related to the Class 9 rating and the survival statistics of ground teams on Class 9 worlds. The valley was wide and green and bisected by a river that ran fast and clear over a pale stone riverbed. I needed to cross it. I assessed the crossing for about 4 minutes, selected a point where the river widened and shallowed, and waded through at thigh depth with my pack held above my head. The current was strong enough to require full attention, but not strong enough to be a serious problem for someone with a low center of gravity and enough stubbornness to not be moved by things that push. I got to the far bank wet from the waist down and approximately 2 degrees colder than I had been. I found a flat rock in a patch of afternoon sunlight and sat on it for 20 minutes while my lower half dried, because hypothermia is a real concern, and managing it is not weakness. It is maintenance. A machine that is allowed to degrade will eventually stop, and I was not going to stop. While I was drying, I noticed the valley's animal life. The valley was obviously a high-traffic zone for multiple species. The riverbank showed the tracks and marks of dozens of different animals, large and small, and the undergrowth beyond the bank was rich and well-fed in the way that happens near reliable water sources. There should have been animals at the river. Any naturalist would expect to find animals at the river during the afternoon hours, drinking, hunting, moving through. The bank in both directions from where I sat was empty. I was not doing anything unusual. I was sitting on a rock, letting my clothes dry, eating a handful of root clusters and the last of the edible seeds I had been collecting since the first day. I was not loud. I was not making any movement that should have registered as threatening. I was simply present. And everything that should have been present was not. I thought about the Vicari pack on the first day. I thought about the Goreth on the fourth. I thought about the quality of space around my campsites, the perimeter that was not mine but felt like it was mine. I turned these observations over in my mind the way I turned problems over when I was working through them, looking for the shape of the answer even before I had enough information to name it. I wrote in my field notes, possible territorial displacement effect observed. My presence appears to create a cleared radius of approximately unknown but significant scale. Animals are not merely avoiding approach, they are vacating area. This is not the behavior pattern of animals responding to a localized threat. This suggests a different category of response. More observation required. I finished drying. I shouldered my pack and kept moving. On the 6th day, I ran out of food entirely. The supplemental foraging had extended my supplies further than I had projected, which meant I was already doing better than the worst-case scenario I had planned for. But doing better than your worst case still means you are hungry. I cataloged my energy reserves honestly. I was tired, I was hungry, my rib was a constant background complaint, and I had approximately 12 days of travel remaining at current pace, which would need to improve to make up time lost on the ridge crossing. The math was not comfortable. It was also not unsurvivable. There is a significant gap between those two things, and living in that gap with clear eyes is what field survival actually is. I spent the 6th day eating whatever I could safely identify from the briefing's flora section, which was not much in the valley terrain, but improved as I climbed out of the valley into the secondary forest zone. I found a cluster of large round fungi on the 7th morning that matched the briefing's description of one of 3 edible Kethvaran fungi species, and I ate a careful portion and waited 2 hours to confirm there was no adverse reaction, and then I ate the rest and felt meaningfully better. Small victories matter. I have never been too proud to count them. On the 7th night, I found the cave. It was at the base of the second ridge, where the rock face met the forest floor, a wide horizontal opening that went back about 15 meters before narrowing. The interior was dry, the temperature was moderate, and there was no smell of current animal habitation, old scent traces, but nothing recent. The floor was flat stone. It was, objectively, the best shelter I had found since the crash. I checked the interior carefully before committing to it. I am not reckless. I moved through the first 10 meters slowly, with my multi-tool in hand and my eyes adjusted to the low light, and I found nothing living and nothing dangerous, and so I made camp at the back, where the narrowing provided a natural wall behind me, and I ate fungi and river-filtered water and settled in for the night. The storm came in about 2 hours after I fell asleep, which I knew because the sound of it woke me. Wind driving rain against the rock face at the cave mouth, the deep percussion of thunder rolling across the ridge above. I listened to it for a moment, assessed that my position was secure, and started to go back to sleep. That was when I heard the shriek kin. They were not inside the cave. I want to be clear about that, because the briefing entry on shriek kin is genuinely alarming, and I do not want to misrepresent what happened. They were at the cave mouth, in the rain, which was unusual behavior for any cave-dwelling species. The briefing described them as optimal ambush hunters in enclosed spaces, fast in the dark, using echolocation and scent tracking to navigate, highly effective in precisely the kind of terrain where a cave mouth during a rainstorm would give them a natural kill corridor, with limited options for anything inside. I lay in the dark at the back of the cave and listened to them. I could hear their breathing, a specific quality of rapid, shallow breath that meant active alert. I could hear the clicking sounds they used for echolocation bouncing off the stone walls and coming back to them with information about the interior. They knew I was there. Their biology told them exactly where I was, what size I was, how I was oriented, and probably how fast my heart was beating. My heart was beating at approximately 52 beats per minute. I knew this because I had trained myself to monitor it the way you monitor any system under stress, not to control it through anxiety, but to know it the way you know the readings on an instrument panel. 52 beats per minute is the lower end of my resting rate. I was not afraid. I was alert, which is a different thing, and I want to be precise about the distinction. Fear tells you to flee or to freeze. Alertness tells you to gather information. I was gathering information. What I learned in the next 20 minutes was this: the shriek kin pack, I counted at least 7 distinct sets of breathing sounds, positioned themselves at the cave mouth and did not come in. They did not advance. They did not spread out to flank me through any secondary entrance, which the cave did not have. They gathered at the entrance to a space that contained one unarmed, sleeping adjacent human and did not enter it. The rain hammered down outside. The thunder rolled. The shriek kin made small sounds to each other, soft and low, nothing like the coordination clicking of a hunting pack. I have read enough xenobiology to know that animals can be cautious. I have read enough behavioral theory to know that apex predators can assess threat levels and sometimes decide the cost of an engagement is too high relative to the potential gain. I understood, lying in that cave, that something was being calculated. I did not know what the calculation included on my side of the ledger. I only knew what it did not include: hesitation. There was no hesitation in me. If they came in, I had already decided what I was going to do and where I was going to do it, and I had selected the narrowest point of the cave interior as a choke point that would limit their numbers, and I had my multi-tool out and oriented, and I was going to keep going until I could not keep going, which is the only plan that makes sense when you have no other options. I was not afraid of this plan. I had committed to it. I had moved past it in my mind to the part where it was already decided, and I was just waiting. Maybe they could smell that too. Maybe the absence of the particular biochemistry of fear, the cortisol spike, the adrenaline flood, the hormonal cascade that every prey animal produces when it understands it is prey, was detectable to creatures who hunted by scent in the dark. I was not prey. I was not pretending not to be prey. I was genuinely, biologically, at a cellular level, not prey. I came from a planet that had been trying to end my species for 200,000 years, and had failed so completely that we had eventually looked up at the sky and decided to go see what else was out there. I had been raised by a woman who walked mountain passes alone at 63 and made tea when she arrived. My body did not know how to produce the chemistry of prey, because the part of my lineage that had produced it had not made it to the age of reproduction. I am being honest about this, not proud of it. I am not saying it makes me special. I am saying it makes me human. It is the inheritance of my species, the thing built into us by the accumulated weight of every morning that required getting up and continuing. The Shriek-kin stayed at the cave mouth for 2 hours. Then quietly, in the hour before dawn, they left. I know they left because the sound stopped and the quality of the cave entrance changed, that particular emptiness that a space has when the living things that were filling it are gone. I lay in the dark for another 10 minutes, confirming it, and then I put my multi-tool back in its clip, adjusted my position, and went back to sleep for the remaining dark hours. I woke at first light. The storm had passed. The air outside smelled clean and green and wet in that specific way that good rain leaves behind. On the rock wall near the cave entrance, partially obscured by lichen but clearly intentional, someone had scratched letters into the stone. I almost missed it. I was packing my camp when the angle of the morning light caught the marks, and I turned and looked at them. They were in Academy Standard script in English, and they read, 17 days, everything moves away from me. I think I might be the monster here, heading northwest. Cadet L. Webb, first cohort. I stood there for a moment and read it twice. L. Webb, I did not know the name. The first cohort assessments had run 3 years ago. Webb had made it 17 days on Kethvara in the Valley system, alone, with the same Class 9 briefing I had been given, and had reached the same observation I was beginning to reach, and had kept moving northwest, which was the correct direction, and the relay station records would tell me later that Lucy Webb had reached the station on day 21 and had been the only member of her assessment group to complete the solo section. I carved one word below her inscription. I used the tip of the pry bar blade, and I made the letters as clean as I could. The word was understood. Then I shouldered my pack and walked out of the cave into the clean morning, and I started up the second ridge. 264 kilometers to the relay station. The forest was already busy and loud and alive all around me, the great churning machinery of a Class 9 world running its endless cycles of feeding and moving and surviving. I moved through it the way I had moved through it every day, at pace, with attention, without stopping. And the forest moved with me, and around me, and away from me, in the way it had since the first day. I still did not fully understand what I was, but I was beginning to have a theory. I came down off the second ridge on day 13 in worse shape than I went up it, because the descent on the far side was steeper than the briefing maps suggested, and I took a fall on a loose section of scree that reopened the rib pain and left me sitting on the ground for 4 minutes doing controlled breathing while I reassessed my situation. 4 minutes is a long time to sit still on Kethvara. I know that now. At the time, I just knew that I needed to get my breathing under control before I could move safely, so I sat and breathed and listened to the forest and waited for my body to report back with something I could work with. Nothing came near me. Not the small scavenger birds that should have been curious about something sitting still on open ground. Not the track-following insects that the briefing said attended everything large that moved through the terrain. Not the ground-level opportunists that followed large animals at a safe distance hopping for scraps. Nothing. The 30-meter radius around me was as clear as if it had been swept. I sat in the center of it and breathed and thought about Lucy Webb's inscription. I think I might be the monster here. The word monster has a specific meaning in most languages. It comes from something warned about, something held up as an example of what to fear. In the old stories, the ones my grandmother told, the ones her grandmother told her, monsters were defined not by what they were but by how they made other things feel. A monster is the thing that changes the behavior of everything around it. A monster is the thing that, when it moves through a landscape, the landscape reorganizes itself in response. I sat on the scree slope with a cracked rib and an empty stomach and looked at the forest that was keeping its distance from me. And I thought about what it meant that a Class 9 lethality world, a planet that had eaten entire research teams, was behaving as though it was the one that needed to be careful. I thought about Earth. I thought about what Earth actually is, when you remove all the civilization and culture and history from it and look at the raw biology of the place. A world that has been producing active large-scale extinction, events on a rolling basis. A world where the dominant species had, within a few 100,000 years of developing coordinated behavior, fundamentally altered the population dynamics of every other species it shared space with. Not because humans were the largest or the fastest or the strongest or the most venomous, but because humans did not stop. Because humans moved through environments with a particular quality of intent that other things found difficult to process. Because the chemistry of a human who has committed to a goal and has not yet reached it is not like the chemistry of any other animal. It is something specific, something old. Something that the predators of Kethvara, in their deep evolutionary memory, had a category for, even if they had never encountered a human before. Persistent ones. That was what I called the concept later when I was trying to explain it to the xenologist who debriefed me. I did not know then that the Keth, the people I was about to meet, had their own word for it, older than their written language, passed down through spoken tradition as a warning rather than a classification. I did not know any of that yet. I just got up off the scree, checked my rib, adjusted my pack and kept moving. On day 14, I found the valley. It was not on any map. It should not have been surprising, given the quality of the Kethvara mapping data, but what was inside it was surprising, or would have been, to anyone who had read the briefing carefully, because the briefing said definitively that Kethvara was uninhabited by sapient life. The survey teams had found no evidence of sapient habitation. No structures, no tool use, no signal emissions of artificial origin. The survey teams, I would later learn, had also consistently stayed on the highland routes that skirted the interior valley systems, because the highland routes were marginally safer, and the interior was rated extreme caution for ground teams. The valley was invisible from orbit due to a persistent atmospheric inversion layer that scattered imaging sensors, and the survey teams had been moving through the landscape quickly, with extraction protocols that did not encourage lingering. They had, in short, looked for evidence of civilization and found none, because they had been looking in the wrong places and in the wrong way. I came down a narrow switchback game trail that opened onto a wide ledge overlooking the valley floor, and below me, 300 meters down and maybe 2 kilometers wide at its widest, there was a settlement. I stopped. I am good at processing information quickly. It is a skill I have worked at, because good processing under pressure is the difference between good decisions and bad ones. So I stood on the ledge and I processed what I was seeing. Structures built from the valley's pale stone and what looked like treated timber, in a pattern that suggested deliberate planning, streets or pathways, open communal areas, enclosures that might be gardens or animal pens. Fire pits that were cold now but had been used recently, judging by the char marks. I could see movement at the lower edges of the settlement, small figures at the distances involved, but moving with the kind of purposeful variability that is unmistakably the movement of thinking creatures going about their business. I sat down on the ledge very carefully, because my rib protested when I did it quickly, and I thought about First Contact Protocol. First Contact Protocol at the Interstellar Academy was a full-semester course. I had taken it. The core principles were: establish benign intent, minimize threat display, defer to the contacted party's pace and comfort, do not make sudden movements, do not arrive in force, do not arrive armed unless necessary for safety. Advanced principles included: do not make assumptions about communication modality, do not assume your expressions of friendliness are legible as friendly, do not assume your expressions of non-threat are legible as non-threatening. I had no communication equipment. I had no translation tools. I had not bathed properly in 14 days, which was relevant because scent is a primary information channel for most biological life, and what I smelled like after 14 days on Kethvara was exactly what you would expect. I had a cracked rib and hollow cheeks, and the specific look of someone who has been outdoors for an extended period and has been managing, not thriving. I was also, by any objective physical measure, considerably larger than the figures I could see moving at the valley floor. I did not fit the profile of a smooth first contact. But I also did not have any option but to make contact, because the relay station was still 230-odd kilometers away, and I needed food, and the valley below me had food, and the people below me were the first beings I had seen in 14 days who might be able to tell me something useful about the terrain ahead. I sat on the ledge for a long time, and then a scout came up the game trail and found me. I heard the scout before I saw them, footsteps on the switchback trail, careful and measured, with the specific quality of someone who is trying to move quietly but is not completely succeeding. I turned my head and watched the trail, and the scout came around the last bend and stopped when they saw me. They were about 1.5 meters tall, with 4 limbs in the standard configuration, covered in a fine gray-green integument that was somewhere between skin and fine scale. Their face was broad and flat, with large amber eyes set wide, and the expression on it when they saw me was, I am going to call it careful, because I did not want to project emotions onto a first contact species, and every other word I considered felt like a projection. They were also very young, not a child, but young in the way you can read in any face that has not yet accumulated the lines that experience puts there. We looked at each other. I moved very slowly and deliberately. I sat back on the ledge, making myself lower. I put my multi-tool on the stone beside me, not reaching for it, just putting it down where it was visible. I opened my hands and rested them on my knees, palms up, which I knew was a legible non-threat gesture in about 60% of known sapient species based on Academy xenosociology. Not great odds, but better than nothing. The scout looked at my hands, looked at the multi-tool, looked at my face. Then they sat down on the trail, cross-legged in a way that mirrored my position in a manner that was almost certainly not accidental. We sat across from each other on a mountain trail above a valley that did not appear on any Academy map, and I understood very clearly that whatever happened next was going to matter, and that I was going to have to navigate it with no tools, no preparation, and nothing but the instincts that 14 days on Kethvara had sharpened past any classroom could. I did the only thing I could think of. I reached into my pack slowly, with deliberate visibility, and I took out the last of the fungi I had been carrying and divided it into 2 equal portions, and set one portion on the trail between us. The scout looked at the fungi for a long moment. Then they reached into the small pack at their side and produced something wrapped in a large dark leaf. They set it on the trail between us, next to the fungi. I waited. They waited. Then I picked up what they had offered and they picked up what I had offered, and we ate, on a mountain trail on a world that was not supposed to have people on it. Two very different creatures sharing a meal because it was the most honest language either of us had available. The scout's name, I would eventually understand, was Vesa, and they were not the least senior member of the youngest cohort because they had been chosen for their scout skills. They were there because the settlement's elders had watched me for 6 days, had held 3 days of intensive debate, and had reached the conclusion that whatever I was, someone needed to go speak to it, and no one wanted to send anyone whose absence would be acutely felt. I did not know any of this as I sat across from Vesa on the trail. I did not know that 6 days of observation had preceded this meeting, or that Vesa had spent the previous night unable to sleep, or that the elders waiting in the valley below had spent those same hours in varying degrees of anxiety about what their scout was walking toward. All I knew was that Vesa had shared their food with me without hesitation after I had shared mine with them, and that this was, in every language I understood or could imagine, a meaningful act. We sat together for a long time after the food was gone. I spoke sometimes, in the simple, clear phrasing I had learned to use in communication exercises, not because I expected Vesa to understand the words, but because the rhythm and tone of speech carries information even without vocabulary. I kept my voice level and unhurried. I made no sudden movements. I did not stand to my full height, which I had noted seemed to register differently for the Keth than it did for humans in humans. Standing up straight is neutral, but for a species whose own dominance signals involve height, a creature my size standing at full height had a very different meaning. Vesa spoke too, eventually. Their language was tonal in a complex way that I had no hope of parsing in real time, but I listened, because listening is the beginning of all understanding, and because the shape of their communication, the pauses, the gestures, the way their eyes tracked, told me things even when the words did not. What I learned from the shape of it was that Vesa was asking questions. What kind of questions, I could not say. But the structure was inquisitive, and the tone was careful, and there was something in Vesa's manner that I recognized after a while as the specific quality of someone who has been sent to do a thing they were not sure they would survive, and who is realizing slowly that they might survive it after all. The relief of that realization, when it began to show in the loosening of the tension Vesa had been carrying since they rounded the trail bend, was one of the most legible things I had seen in 14 days. I recognized it because I had been carrying the same tension since the crash, and I had been releasing it incrementally, one solved problem at a time, in the way that you do when you are managing a situation rather than letting it manage you. I smiled at Vesa. Vesa went completely still. I stopped smiling immediately and looked away, because the stillness had the quality of someone encountering an unexpected threat display, and I had just made a significant communication error. In human terms, a smile is the most basic signal of benign intent we have. In Keth terms, I would learn this later, over the extended and complicated evening that followed in the valley, barring the teeth with the mouth open and the eyes focused directly on the other party, is a dominant signal used in the run-up to confrontation, and for a creature my size to produce it while making direct eye contact was, in Keth social language, approximately equivalent to a formal declaration of intent to compete. Vesa, who was young and very self-controlled, did not run. They stayed on the trail and held the stillness for a full second and then, slowly, relaxed again. I stared at a rock next to Vesa's left knee, and made a mental note that my face was going to be a diplomatic problem. The walk down to the valley took about 2 hours, and it was accompanied by a gathering awareness on my part that I was going to need to manage almost every natural human behavior I had: eye contact, facial expression, posture, movement pace, because most of what my body did by default was apparently being read as something it was not intended to be. This was not distressing. It was a problem to be solved, like every other problem, and I filed it and started working on it. The settlement up close was larger and more complex than it had appeared from the ledge. The buildings were well made, the pathways were maintained, and the communal areas showed evidence of regular use. There were craft tools and food processing equipment and storage structures, and what appeared to be a workshop area where materials were being worked into shapes I did not yet have context for. It was a functioning, organized, thriving community, in a valley that no one had mapped on a world that the Academy's database listed as uninhabited. The Keth of the settlement came out to look at me. They were careful about it. They did not rush. They gathered in a loose crescent around the entrance to the main communal area at a distance of about 15 meters, and they watched. I was very conscious of not making eye contact with anyone, of keeping my movements slow and my posture low, of breathing steadily and letting my presence settle into the space without demanding anything from it. An elder, I could identify her as such by the specific quality of stillness with which she held herself, that particular authority that has nothing to do with physical size, stood at the center of the crescent and observed me for a very long time without speaking. Then she said something to Vesa, who replied, and she considered the reply, and then she said something else, and Vesa turned to me and made a gesture toward the communal area that I recognized across every species as come in. I went in. The evening that followed was, as I said, extended and complicated. There were many things I did wrong. I stood at my full height at one point while reaching for something, and there was a collective ripple of reaction that I immediately recognized and corrected by sitting back down. I made direct eye contact with a young child who ran up to me without fear and grabbed my hand with both of theirs, and the elders had a visible reaction to that which Vesa spent several minutes addressing. I produced the multi-tool to cut a fruit I had been offered because I wanted to share it, and the sight of the blade caused a moment of absolute silence that lasted 4 seconds before Vesa spoke and the silence resolved. But there were things I did right. I ate everything I was offered. I sat when invited to sit and stayed seated when I should have stayed seated. I let Vesa pace the communication, following their lead on when to speak and when to be quiet. I asked no questions with my posture or my expression or my movements. I made no claim on anything in that space. And the elder watched all of this, and I watched her watching, and I understood that I was being assessed with the same careful attention I was giving to everything around me. Somewhere in the middle of the evening, she said something to Vesa that Vesa translated, or rather, attempted to translate, through gesture and expression, and the approximately 4 words of standard lingua franca that Vesa had somehow managed to acquire, which I suspected came from some very old contact record I was not aware of, as approximately, "Your world is like this world." I thought about Kithvora, I thought about Earth. Vesa was asking if they were similar, in terms of difficulty, in terms of what they required of the things that lived on them. I said similar, yes, but Earth has less forest. Vesa stared at me for a moment, working through that, and then conveyed it to the elder, and the elder looked at me for a very long time in silence, and then said something that Vesa did not attempt to translate, but that was accompanied by a gesture I could not mistake. A gesture toward the forest visible beyond the settlement walls, the great living darkness of Kethvara's primary jungle. With all that lived in it and all that moved through it, and all that the Keth had spent generations understanding and surviving, and then back to me. The elder was not afraid of the forest. She had lived alongside it her entire life, but she was indicating it to me in a way that asked, "You come from something like that, from something that requires what this requires." I looked at the forest. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the trail behind me, 14 days long, and the Vikari and the Goreth and the Shriek Kin and the river and the ridge and all of it, All the small and large obstacles that the world had placed in my path, each one of which I had gone through or around or past, one at a time, without stopping. I looked back at the elder. "Yes," I said, "I come from somewhere like that." The elder held my gaze, the first direct eye contact anyone in the settlement had initiated with me, for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded. And something in the room changed. Not in the way of a decision made exactly, but in the way of a category resolved, the particular shift that happens when something that was uncertain becomes understood, when a question that has been held open finally finds its shape. I did not know then what category I had been placed in. I only knew that the change was a settling rather than a sharpening, a relaxation rather than a tension, and that Vesa, across the space, was breathing more easily than they had since we sat on the trail. I stayed in the settlement for 2 nights and 1 full day. The Keth fed me, properly, generously, food that was warm and caloric and the most welcome thing I had encountered in 2 weeks. Vesa and I developed a working communication system built on gesture and expression, and the small vocabulary that 2 determined people can build in a day when they need to. I learned that the valley had been inhabited for many generations, that the Keth had known other peoples lived beyond the valley but had had no direct contact, that they had been watching me since I entered the valley system from the ridge. 6 days of watching. I asked Vesa, as best I could, what they had seen during those 6 days. What had made the elders decide to send a scout? Vesa was quiet for a moment. Then Vesa made a series of gestures that I interpreted, slowly and with some uncertainty, as the animals moved. They moved away from you, always, every kind of animal. We watched you walk and we watched everything in front of you move aside, and we have never seen that before, not for anything. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, I did not know that was happening. Vesa looked at me with those wide amber eyes and said something that did not translate exactly but that I understood in its shape and its weight to mean, "We know. That is why we sent someone." On the morning of the 3rd day, Vesa walked with me to the edge of the valley and pointed me toward the northwest, and showed me the route the Keth used when they traveled to the highland. A route that would cut 30 kilometers off my remaining distance and avoid the worst of the secondary terrain that had been slowing me. I had 212 kilometers to the relay station. I had good food in my pack and good information about the route. I looked at Vesa, standing at the valley's edge in the morning light, and I tried to think of what to say that would carry the weight of what the last 2 days had meant. I said, "Thank you." Vesa nodded. Then Vesa said something I could not translate and reached out and briefly, deliberately, touched the back of my hand with their fingertips. The same gesture the child had made when they ran up to me on the first evening. I learned later that it was a Keth gesture of meaning roughly, "Travel well. I carry knowledge of you." I did not know that then, but I understood it. I turned northwest and walked. Behind me, the valley was quiet and alive, and going about its business in the way that well-ordered things do. Ahead of me, the forest was already making its adjustments, the animals in the distances of the trail system aware before I arrived that something was moving toward them, something that would require their consideration, something that would require them to make room. 212 kilometers. I walked. The relay station was a prefab structure, a single room, solar-powered, with a communication array on the roof and an emergency supply cache in a locked container beside the door. I reached it on the afternoon of the 23rd day. I know the exact time because the station's internal clock logged my arrival, which I accessed by entering my Academy identification code into the external panel. I stood outside the door for a moment before I went in. I had been moving for 23 days. I had covered 340 kilometers through primary jungle, 2 mountain ridges, 1 river valley, 1 unmapped valley, and a highland route that existed only in the knowledge of a people who were not supposed to exist on this planet. I had cracked ribs, a deficit of about 4 kilograms in body mass, and more information about Kethvara than any previous ground team had accumulated in the planet's survey history. I went inside, activated the communication array, and transmitted an emergency signal on the Academy's rescue frequency. Then I opened the supply cache and found a meal kit, and I sat on the floor of the relay station and ate the first fully cooked, fully calibrated, nutritionally complete meal I had had in 23 days, and it was one of the best things I have ever eaten in my life. The rescue shuttle arrived 31 hours later. The pilot was a Dreth, a species I had studied in xenobiology but never met in person, 6-limbed and cephalopod-adjacent in their body plan, known in Academy culture for a manner that most species read as cold, but that I had been told by a Dreth professor was simply efficient. The pilot looked at me when I came out of the relay station, dusty, thin, rib-taped, still wearing the same field gear I had crashed in, and said, without preamble or excessive warmth, "Status." I said, "Cracked rib, nutritional deficit, no significant infection, mobile and functional." The pilot said, "Good," and handed me a protein pack, and told me the flight time to the Academy medical station was 4 hours. I got on the shuttle. I want to say something about those 4 hours, because I had been alone for 23 days and suddenly I was not alone, and I had expected to feel something specific about that, relief, maybe, or the particular loosening that happens when you have been carrying something heavy and you are finally able to put it down. I had expected to feel the weight of the 23 days land on me all at once, the way it sometimes does when the immediate pressure is removed. What I felt instead was quieter than that. I felt the specific satisfaction of a complete thing, of a distance covered and a destination reached and a problem solved. The 23 days were not weight. They were information. They were everything I had learned and everything I had done and everything I had understood, slowly and incrementally, about what I was and where I came from, and what that meant in the larger context of the universe I was moving through. I also felt the absence of Vessa's Valley, with a sharpness I had not expected. I had been alone for 23 days, and I had not been lonely during most of them, because loneliness requires a sense that something is missing, and I had been too occupied to miss things. But the 2 days in the valley had given me something that the solo transit had not, which was the experience of being unknown to someone, and then becoming known, of communicating across a gap that should have been uncrossable and finding that it crossed, of being recognized, not as a threat, not as an anomaly, but as a thing with a name and a home and a nature, which could be understood if you sat with it long enough and paid careful attention. I had been recognized by the elder's direct gaze, those 3 seconds of held eye contact that meant something in Keth's social language I did not yet know, but felt with complete clarity. I thought about that on the shuttle. I thought about Vessa. I thought about Lucy Webb's inscription in the cave wall and the one word I had carved below it. The debrief was 2 days after I returned to the Academy. Once the medical team had confirmed the rib and addressed the nutritional deficit and cleared me for formal interview. The debriefing officer was an Academy-qualified xenologist named Dr. Corbin Shaw, a human in his 50s, with the patient, slightly exhausted manner of someone who has spent a long time talking to people who have seen things that are difficult to explain. I explained them anyway, as clearly and precisely as I could. Shaw's manner shifted 3 times during the interview. The first shift was when I described the Vakari Pack's retreat. The second was when I described the Gorath stepping off the path. The third was when I described the Shriek Kin at the cave mouth. Then I told him about the Keth. Shaw put down his recording stylus and looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You are telling me that on a planet rated uninhabited, you made first contact with an unmapped sapient species, and that the first contact was initiated with shared food on a game trail." I said, "Yes." He said, "And prior to this contact, You observed consistent avoidance behavior across multiple megafauna species, including 3 species rated survival incompatible for unarmed contact. I said yes. He said, and you are proposing that this behavior was triggered by your presence rather than any external factor. I said, I am not proposing it. I am reporting what I observed and leaving the interpretation to people with better tools for it than I have. Jean picked up his stylus. He wrote 3 papers. I read all of them later. None of them fully captured it, though Shaw was honest about the limitations of his framework, and the first paper included a footnote that I thought was the closest any of the 3 came to the truth. The footnote said, the cadet's account raises the possibility that certain evolutionary signatures, behavioral, chemical, postural, that are present in humans as a consequence of their homeworld selection pressures may function as interspecies threat markers in ways that human subjects cannot self-observe. The cadet displayed no anomalous behavioral traits during the academy assessment period. The effect, if it exists as described, operates at a biological level below the threshold of conscious behavioral choice. Below the threshold of conscious behavioral choice. That was the way Shaw said it, the academic way. What it meant, translated out of the academic into the plain, was she was not trying to do anything. She was just being human, and that was enough. The Academy reviewed the Kethvara solo assessment data after my debrief. All 9 human cadets who had completed the course since its establishment had returned. The survival rate for the non-human cohorts was 68%, which was considered good for a Class 9 world. The human rate was 100%, which was considered anomalous. The review committee added a note to the Kethvara file recommending further study, and flagged the planet for reclassification, pending the ongoing Keth contact protocols that my report had initiated. They gave me a commendation for the first contact handling. I used it to have a frame made. Inside the frame, I put the photograph I had taken from the relay station's emergency supply cache, a printed image of the Academy seal that was presumably there for morale purposes and that I repurposed as backing material. On the image of the Academy seal, I wrote Lucy Webb's words from the cave wall in careful letters. 17 days. Everything moves away from me. I think I might be the monster here. And below them, my single word, understood. The frame hangs in my quarters at the Academy. People ask about it sometimes. I tell them it is a note from a colleague. I enrolled in advanced xenodiplomacy 6 weeks after I returned. In the application, I listed my skills as field medicine, navigation, terrain assessment, foraging, endurance management, and basic first contact communication under adverse conditions. I did not list the other thing. I was not sure how to list it accurately, and I did not want to overstate it. But I knew what it was. I had known since the cave, since Lucy Webb's words and the 7 sets of breathing sounds at the entrance that had decided, in their deep biological calculation, that this space was not worth entering. I knew what I was. At the final review interview for the xenodiplomacy program, the interviewing board asked me why I wanted to specialize in first contact work. There were 3 of them, 2 humans and a Velka, who were known for asking follow-up questions that went in unexpected directions. I had prepared for this. I told them the truth, which is that I believe first contact is the single most consequential thing that any representative of any species can do, because what you communicate in those first minutes is not policy or protocol or the considered position of any institution. It is what you are, at the deepest level, before any training or preparation has had time to intervene. The Velka board member asked what I thought I communicated. I thought about the game trail. I thought about Vesa sitting down across from me and mirroring my position without being asked. I thought about the elder's 3-second gaze. I said, I hope I communicated that I was trying to understand them, and that I was not going to stop trying. The Velka made a notation. The 2 humans wrote something. The senior human board member, a woman named Dr. Cora Bell, who had been doing this work for 30 years and had the specific quality of attention that comes from having paid it carefully for a long time, looked at me for a moment. She said, "Your assessment file from Kethvara notes that every major predator species you encountered yielded rather than engaged. Do you have a personal theory about why that was?" I had thought about this for a long time. I said, "I think the planet recognized something in me that it did not have a category for. Not a predator and not prey. Something that keeps moving regardless of what it encounters, because stopping is not part of the available options. I come from a world that produces that quality in its people by necessity. And I think the things that live on Kethvara, at the level of instinct and deep biological knowledge, understood that an encounter with something that does not stop is a cost-benefit calculation with no good outcome." Dr. Bell wrote something. Then she said, "And do you think that quality is dangerous?" It was not the question I had expected. I took a moment with it. I said, "Any quality that changes the behavior of everything around it is potentially dangerous. The question is whether the change it causes moves toward understanding or away from it. On Kethvara, the animals moved away. Vesa moved toward. I think the difference was choice. Vesa chose to sit down on that trail because they were curious and controlled and determined enough to override whatever their biology was telling them. The animals could not make that choice. They operated on instinct." I paused. I said, "I want to do work that gives people the choice. That creates the conditions where the things that are curious and controlled and determined enough can sit down on the trail. The rest takes care of itself." Dr. Bell looked at me for one more moment. Then she said, "Welcome to the program, Cadet Solano. I am writing this 3 years after Kethvara. I am writing it because the Academy has asked for a personal account as part of the ongoing documentation of the Keth Contact Project, which has expanded significantly since my initial report and now involves a full diplomatic team that includes, as its liaison officer, Cadet Second Class Vesa of the Keth Settlement, who agreed to join the project 6 months ago, and who is, by every measure I have seen, the best communicator I have ever worked alongside. Vesa told me, through the translation systems we now have access to, that the settlement elders had debated what to do about me for 3 days before sending Vesa to the trail. They had been afraid that I was something their world had not produced and therefore did not have tools for. They had been afraid that my presence would change things in ways they could not predict. They were right, of course. My presence did change things. Things always change when two peoples who did not know each other become known to each other. The Keth Valley is not the same as it was before I came down off that ridge. Neither is the Academy's understanding of Kethvara. Neither, honestly, is my understanding of myself. But the elder looked at me for those 3 seconds, and she chose to let me in. I think about that choice more than I think about anything the animals did. The animals responded to what I was without being able to do anything else. The elder chose her response, out of all the responses available to her, with full knowledge of what she was choosing and why. That is what I want to do with the rest of my career, not to be the thing that makes predators step aside, though if that is a tool I carry, I intend to use it carefully and honestly, but to be the thing that gives thinking beings the information they need to choose to sit down on the trail, to choose curiosity over fear, to choose the shared meal on the stone. My grandmother walked 40 kilometers through a mountain pass at 63 because she had somewhere to be. She arrived and made tea and went to bed. She did not think she had done anything remarkable. She had simply gone where she needed to go, the way she always had, the way her people always had, the way we have always done on the world that made us and keeps making us, generation by generation, one morning at a time. I am Nora Solano's granddaughter. I went where I needed to go. And on the way, I sat down on a trail with a very nervous scout, and I shared my lunch, and everything that followed came from that single ordinary act. I do not think I am a monster. I think I am what happens when a world that never stopped producing survivors sends one of them out to meet the rest of the universe, and the universe has to decide what to do about her. So far, the universe has mostly chosen to sit down. I am very grateful for that. And I am not for one single step of any of it going to stop.